Hello once again. This is the second in a series of lectures on macroeconomics, and this is Dr. Anthony Liberatore. So in this section, we're going to build on our circular flow model and look into GDP with a little more detail. Let's go back and review the circular flow model. Of course, I asked you to memorize this, so you should have this in your mind's eye, but let me go through it quickly. There are three major macro markets: expenditures at the top are product markets, money markets in the middle, and factor markets at the bottom. Households receive income from firms for providing resources to the firms. In turn, they can either spend or save this income. The spending part is called consumption, or C, and the savings part is S, flows into financial institutions or money markets. The three financial intermediaries here that we talked about were banks, stock markets, and insurance companies. This money is repurposed or reused for investment in the economy. The two primary components are plant and equipment and housing. Government participates as a complementary sector in the system, receiving its revenues through taxes and moving these revenues back into the system as transfers for Social Security and other elements. And government also buys goods and services labeled G. To open the economy, we have exports and imports. And measuring GDP, that is gross domestic product, from the top loop of the circular flow is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And from the bottom loop, income, abbreviated, is equal to wages, rent, interest, and profit, going to the four factors of production: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. So let's move on from look at this notion of intermediate versus final goods and services. So GDP measures final goods and services, and here I'd like to just explore that idea. We have a factory on the left, and you can see the automated machines, and the output is an automobile. Now, to make this automobile, we need, of course, this physical plant and equipment, labeled K in economics, and we need inputs. So we need intermediate goods: steel, plastic, glass, tires, electronics, etc. And we need factors of production. Now, the four factors of production we talked about were labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship or management. So we combine the intermediate goods, all the things that go into making the car, and the primary factors of production. And when we put these together in a process, which we would call a production process, here represented by our little factory, these things are combined to create an output, which is an automobile here, a car. And this is our final good and service. So we'd like to make a distinction in measuring GDP between the final good and services, that is the car, and the intermediate goods, that is the things that go into making it. The intermediate goods that are purchased by the auto firm, such as steel and plastic, go into the value of the car, so the entire set of goods and services going into the car is measured by the sale of the car. So when we're measuring GDP, we're going to count only final goods and services, but here we get some of our language straight. That is, we have a production process. The two components really going into the production process are intermediate goods and factors of production. These things combine in the production process, produce our final good or service. All right, so let's move in. Definition of gross domestic product. So I have it in four components here. It's one definition, but market value of final goods and services produced in the U.S. in a given year. And let's deal with each component of this definition. Market value refers to what we pay for things. Now, obviously, if we go and purchase a car, say for $50,000, that's part of GDP. That's the market value. And here, movie tickets, you buy cigarettes, and so these have market value. One of the curious things about GDP is it measures anything that's produced. So medical care would be part of the GDP in the economy. So the GDP is not a perfect measure because we're measuring activity, but here I've got cigarettes and cancer. Cigarettes is a productive enterprise where people are employed, so that adds to GDP. But so does the treatment of cancer, which is a negative that's caused by cigarettes. So one of the things we want to get clear right from the beginning is that GDP is not a perfect measure of anything. It's a measure of the activity in the economy, good, bad, or indifferent. And here you can see price of car, movie tickets, cigarettes. These are all things that we consume. One of the consequences of cigarettes is cancer, but that shows up as a positive contribution to GDP. So GDP is an imperfect measure, but it does give us a measure of the economic activity taking place. Not only does it capture some of these negatives, but it also misses some pieces. So illegal activities, although they create jobs and income in the economy, are not measured because they're illegal. So we'd have selling marijuana, for example, is illegal, but there's activity associated with it. So illegal activities. Unreported income. You may be doing work, cutting lawns, and that makes you a firm, but you don't report it because you're taking it in cash. So this isn't unreported income or part of the underground economy, so it's missed by GDP. Self-perform work. If you clean your house, that's just part of your work. It doesn't have a market value, but if you hire someone to clean the house, then that's generating income and employment, so that's part of GDP. So GDP doesn't capture everything, and although pollution is a negative and detracts from GDP because it causes a deterioration in the environment and probably in life expectancy, etc., this is not captured as a negative or deducted from GDP. In fact, if the pollution causes sickness, that sickness will show up as an economic activity created, and that would be a positive. So GDP is not a perfect measure, but it is a gross measure of economic activity. Final goods and services are the things that are at the end of the pipeline, as we just saw. A car is at the end of the pipeline, so we'll count that. That will include all the components that flow into the car, and so we're going to count final goods and services, but no intermediate goods. That is, we're not going to count what firms buy to put into the product that they sell at the end of the pipeline. So, final goods and services, food, clothing, autos, entertainment. No stocks, because that's just a change of ownership, for example. But the investment services that are provided are part of GDP. So, for example, we want to capture the services that are related to the activity, but only to final goods and services. Intermediate goods, of course, are excluded. That's tires included in the auto at the final purchase price, so we're not going to double count those. Or the chips in a computer. Even though chip making is a big industry, we're going to capture the value of the chips when we sell the computer. So final goods and services, no intermediate goods, because we want to avoid the problem of double counting. Produced in the U.S., that is on our shores, because we want to measure activities creating income and jobs within the country. So we're going to have to add in exports that are not captured in domestic consumption. So California wine that's sold overseas, that would be an export. We have to add that in. Mercedes made in the United States, that's produced in the U.S., so that counts here. Medical equipment sold in China, that's an export, so that will have to be added in. French wine that we purchase, that's an import, so we're going to net that out. But again, the service of the provider of that wine is part of current income, so the profit and income of the wine store will become part of GDP. Ferraris, which are Italian race cars, are made in Italy, so the car is not part of GDP, but the income of the dealer is. So we're going to net out exports and imports and capture all of the exports, and take out all of the imports. In a given year, this means only goods produced this year, not goods produced in other years. So no used goods or leftover goods. Look at that in a little more detail. So if we had a 1964 Chevy, that's in the GDP of 1964. But if it's resold, say, in the year 2000, then the dealer income in the year 2000 is part of GDP. So no used goods. So let me take another example. Suppose you have a car that's made this year and sold this year. That would be part of GDP in this current year. But suppose we have a car that was made last year, but sold this year. So it was made in year 1, but sold in year 2. Well, the car is obviously part of GDP in year 1. But the sale of the car in year 2 has a service component, so the income of the car dealer in year 2 is part of GDP in year 2. So in order to capture the fact that some things are made outside of the current year is captured through an adjustment in inventories. So we would capture inventory changes in any given year in order to make GDP compatible with current year production. So in the GDP accounts, we said we can measure GDP as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. In investment, we have plant and equipment, housing, and net inventories. So the net inventory component is capturing these spillovers from year to year as a gross number. So here's the definition of GDP. Market value of final goods and services produced in the U.S. in a given year. Now we can get a lot more detailed about what's in or what's out, but the thing we want to recognize is that this is an approximation of the activity in the economy that generates income and employment. It's not a perfect measure. It's missing illegal activities and underground activities. It's capturing some of the negatives as a positive, for example, medical treatment that we may be causing from pollution or cigarettes, etc. And it's ignoring many of the negatives of pollution. So we don't mean to use GDP as if it was cast in stone. Again, it's an approximation, and we can see how this changes from year to year. A growth in gross domestic product means there's more economic activity and more income, so this is a good measure of the progress of an economy and its ability to produce. Notion of the equality of the top loop and the bottom loop in the circular flow model. In other words, why does income at the bottom equal GDP or expenditures at the top? And this has something to do with the intermediate versus final goods and services. So let me create just a hypothetical simple economy here. In our economy, we're taking iron ore out of the ground, and this is being used to make steel, and the steel is used to make a hammer. So the only thing that is being made at the end in this economy is the hammer. All right? And I'd like to trace through the stages of the production of this economy. So at the top here I have intermediate goods, value added, and market value. So let's start with the iron ore. Well, the iron ore is in the ground, and when it's in the ground, of course, it has no market value. It's just sitting there. And when you have to dig it out, you can move it to market and sell it. Now, there are no components going into the iron ore. It's just given from nature. So there are no intermediate goods going into iron ore. It's just a natural resource. But when we dig it out, we make it useful to someone, and we transport it and we make it available. So we've added value to it. That is, we've added, say, $2 of value, and we can sell it then for $2. So the market value is $2. So here we'd like to get the notion of the production process in our heads. That is, when you produce something, you add value to it, and then you sell it in the market for a certain price. Here with the iron ore, no intermediate goods or no inventories going into it. We move it to the market, that adds value to it, and we can sell it for $2. So we've added $2 to the value of that natural resource. Now, to make steel, we need to purchase the iron ore. And so the iron ore is an intermediate good into the production of steel, say $2. We go through the process of making the steel. We've added value to it, say $6, and we sell it for $8 in the market. So the notion of production or transformation is that we cannot create or destroy matter, but we can transform it. And when we transform it, we're adding value to it. The transformation can be that we just move it from one place to the next so it's available to people, such as Walmart. We distribute it from the manufacturer to the buyer, and that adds value. Or we can take iron ore and transform it into steel with other things, and this adds value to it. So now it has a market value of $8. But the steel goes into making the hammer. So we have $8 in the intermediate good for the hammer. And its market value then, we're able to sell it for $17, which implies that we've added $9 in value to the hammer. And this is the nature of economic activity. You cannot create or destroy matter, but you can transform it and add value to it. So here in this simple economy, let me ask you, what's the value of GDP? Well, GDP is the gross domestic product, and it's the market value of final goods and services produced in the U.S. in a given year. So what here in the simple economy is the final good and service? Well, that's the hammer, and its value is $17. So GDP has a value of $17. That's the upper loop in the circular flow model, or in the national income and product accounts. Now, along the way, we've taken the iron ore, steel, and hammer and added value all along the way. Well, let's take the hammer, for example. The intermediate goods into the hammer, steel, were $8. But then we have to combine with these intermediate goods the factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So this $9 then is going back to the factors of production. We're paying labor. We're paying the wages on labor, paying the rent on land, the interest on capital, and what's left is profit for the owners. So this $9 represents the payments to the factors of production. That is, this $9 represents what is value added in the production process. And it goes to households or the 4 factors of production. So here we can see that if we add 2, 6, and 9, we get 17. In other words, value added in the production process is $17. These are the income flows in the economy. So the bottom loop is 17. It's equal to the top loop. GDP is equal to income. And here's an explanation of the fact that production is the process of adding value, and the adding value is measured by the income or the payments of the factors of production. So GDP is equal to income, which is equal to the value added in the production process. What we mean by value added is that we've transformed products, and in this transformation we have to use the factors of production, and they reap the income from this transformation. Another interesting point here that we'd like to make explicit about the economy is that it starts from zero. If we look at this table, we started with nothing. That is, we started with the iron ore in the ground. It didn't have market value, but we had natural resources. Essentially, every economy starts at zero. And if we took a year and say we started at zero and we went through the year, and at the end we measured GDP as $20 trillion, That means we've taken what the earth and natural resources have given us, and we've applied our human ingenuity and skills and the factors of production to these resources and added $20 trillion in value. Now, starting from zero is an interesting point, because if we have an aggregate of production, this is the aggregate of income that's available. And every year this process is continuing, or if we think about it as just a snapshot, it starts over and we create new production. Well, simply understanding this tells us a little bit about the macroeconomy. That is, an economy can only consume essentially in the limit of what it produces, and its wealth is determined by production. If we have 20 trillion and we produce that, we can share that amongst everyone in the economy, and we have a certain level of wealth. If we made 40 trillion, then we're a little wealthier. So if we go back to Adam Smith and look at his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, we can ask ourselves, what determines the wealth of a nation? Well, obviously, that's what we produce. It's production. It's not the gold in the ground or the natural resources in the ground. It's our transformational capabilities. So the wealth of nations is determined by your ability to produce goods and services and to share that in your economy. In this section, we've looked at the definition of GDP. It's the market value of final goods and services produced in the U.S. We're going to count only final goods, no intermediate goods. And this is an imperfect measure, but we could also see that the economy starts from zero, and in the transformation process, we've transformed what nature has given us into, say, $20 trillion. We've added value of $20 trillion, and this has created $20 trillion in income. In the next section, we're going to look at the measurement of GDP in more detail, and so we're going to look at some of the numbers and how we calculate the estimates of measures of GDP and of prices, that is, market value and prices. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next lecture.